The end of World War II saw the scrapping and mothballing of many of the United States Navy ships, and by 1948, there remained just over 250 vessels in service. This large-scale decommissioning of ships ended with the rising tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. While the Korean War brought these tensions to a head, the U.S. Navy did not often have direct involvement in the conflicts that took place. Instead, the Navy assisted with large-scale landings at Incheon, where Navy and Marine Corps amphibious forces succeeded in driving back North Korean forces, and at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, where the evacuation of over 100,000 UN troops required U.S. Navy assistance. Korea made it clear to the United States government that our Navy would have to be ever ready to react to threats, especially during the Cold War, where all eyes were on the Soviets. The United States Navy needed to be ready to respond in the event of aggressive communist threats. Fleets of ships were assigned to every corner of the globe, and as the ships were dispatched, Navy scientists and technicians developed new technologies in communications and defense, as well as new missiles and jet-propelled aircraft. Under the guidance of Admiral Hyman Rickover, the Navy received its first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. Rickover was a longtime proponent of the nuclear marine propulsion program. However, he regarded nuclear power and the atomic bomb as necessary evils. On May 5th, 1961, a Redstone rocket launched the first American to travel in space, Alan Shepard. Shepard was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School. He had served on the destroyer USS Cogswell in the Pacific during World War II and was one of 110 test pilots selected to volunteer as part of the famous Mercury 7, NASA's first U.S. manned space program. He was the only member of that initial class of astronauts who would walk on the moon. When he commanded the Apollo 14 mission in 1971. Astronaut Jim Lovell was another graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and was selected as part of the initial group of volunteers. Medical reasons kept Lovell out of the Mercury program, but he was selected in 1962 as part of NASA Astronaut Group 2. Lovell went on to serve in both the Gemini and Apollo programs. He piloted the Gemini 7 and 12, the latter mission flown with Buzz Aldrin. He became one of the first men to travel to the moon on Apollo 9, completing 10 orbits on Christmas Eve, 1968, before returning to the Earth safely 3 days later. Lovell is perhaps best known as the commander of the Apollo 13 mission. When the Odyssey command module that carried Lovell and pilots Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes became crippled due to an oxygen tank explosion, Lovell's leadership brought the crew back to Earth safely after using the lunar module as a kind of lifeboat and manually adjusting the craft's trajectory, only using his wristwatch for timing. The mission had intended to land on the moon. However, in the resulting survival mission, the crew of the Apollo 13 became the record holders for farthest distance ever traveled from the planet Earth.
First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. This quarantine will be extended, if needed, to other types of cargo and carriers. We are not at this time, however, denying the necessities of life, as the Soviets attempted to do in their Berlin blockade of 1948. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
After two unsuccessful CIA-led attempts to quash communist leadership in Cuba, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and Cuban leader Fidel Castro agreed that Soviet nuclear missiles based on the island nation would prevent any future U.S. invasion attempts. When, on October 14, 1962, a United States U-2 aircraft returned with photographs showing definite evidence of sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles, what came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis was underway. Immediately, President Kennedy and the Joint Chiefs, as well as other top military advisors, began to plan for and stop what could have been the kickoff of all-out nuclear war. Without a formal declaration of war on Cuba, international law and convention would prohibit a naval blockade against the island. A system of quarantine was initiated, whereby U.S. Navy aircraft carriers, destroyers, and other vessels would not permit any transit of munitions or ordnance of any type to enter the country. Merchant ships and food and supply ships were allowed to pass after inspection. With the quarantine came the demand from the United States: remove and disassemble the missile bases on Cuba and send all offensive weapons back to the Soviet Union. Kennedy expected military retaliation from the Soviets, but 13 days later, the Soviet Union and Kennedy's cabinet reached an agreement, sending all of the Cuban missiles back to the USSR in exchange for the United States nuclear disarmament in Italy and Turkey. The crisis was perhaps the most tense moment of the Cold War, and the closest we might have come to World War III.
It is one thing for politicians here at home, safe in the security of their political offices, to vote to send young American draftees to die in an unconscionable war in Vietnam. But it is another thing to be one of those boys. I do not intend to put their blood on my hands.
Vietnam was almost never a popular war. Its very beginnings sparked controversy, and continued American involvement in the conflict led to one of the lowest points for the United States Armed Forces. On August 2nd, 1964, the United States destroyer USS Maddox was conducting a secret intelligence mission in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam when it came under attack from 3 North Vietnamese Navy P-4 torpedo boats 28 miles away from the North Vietnamese coast in international waters. The Maddox suffered minor damage from only a 14.5mm machine gun bullet. Also adding to the contention was an alleged second attack 2 days later on the Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, which has since been chalked up to a radar glitch and overzealous communications officers making incorrect reports. Nonetheless, President Johnson used the evidence presented to petition Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson authority to use conventional military force in any Southeast Asian country that displayed signs of communist aggression or expansion.
That I shall immediately request the Congress to pass a resolution making it clear that our government is united in its determination to take all necessary measures in support of freedom and in defense of peace in Southeast Asia.
For the first time since the American Civil War, U.S. Navy forces found themselves engaged in operations on rivers and other tributaries in Vietnam. The River Patrols, or Brown Water Navy, consisted of river patrol boats or patrol air cushion vehicles, also known as hovercraft, that would patrol areas unable to be reached by their larger mothership. Also at play on the rivers was the patrol craft, also known as swift boats. The swift boats were largely responsible for intercepting movements of Viet Cong munitions and arms, as well as transportation of Vietnamese allies and SEAL teams there to quash insurgencies. Working in cooperation with the Navy was the United States Coast Guard, which operated 26 Point-class cutters on the rivers as well. As U.S. forces were scaled back, these vessels were all donated to the South Vietnamese Navy as part of the United States effort to hand the reins of the war over to the Vietnamese people.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.